for joining me. My name is Mindy Mandell. Today we're going to talk about the dialogue Symposium. Symposium is one of Plato's most famous dialogues, I think, and it's a really good one. We're going to be talking about love and about beauty, but there's actually a whole lot more going on here. So let's get into it. As with many of Plato's dialogues, this one is a flashback. And our storyteller today is a man named Apollodorus. Apollodorus, we learn, has spent the last 2 or 3 years studying Socrates' words and actions. And here's a quote, and by the way, all of our translations today are by the translator Walter Lamb. All right, so Apollodorus says that it is not yet 3 years that I've been consorting with Socrates and making it my daily care to know whatever he says and does. So this dialogue is a retelling of a conversation that took place many years earlier when Apollodorus was just a child. So he was not present for the discussion. He heard it from a friend and he confirmed the account with Socrates. He says, I have since questioned Socrates on some details of the story I had from his friend, and he acknowledged them to be in accordance with his account. Well, I've spoken on past videos about the significance of these retellings, but for those of you who are new to the channel, I'll just say a word or two. Basically, we find that the better we understand a topic, the better we're able to remember a conversation about it. Right? So what we see in all of these introductions that are flashbacks is that Socrates has excellent recall. But others remember to varying degrees, and it depends on their level of experience. All right, well, on to the story. The story takes place on the night of a dinner party. And the dinner party is held at the home of a man named Agathon. Agathon is a successful writer of tragic plays. In fact, just the day before this party, he won first prize in a writing contest. Now, the friend who told Apollodorus the story is a man named Aristodemus. We've got a lot of names to keep in mind here. Aristodemus met Socrates on the road. He himself was not initially invited to the dinner party. So he, Aristodemus, said that he met with Socrates fresh from the bath and wearing his best pair of slippers, quite rare events with him, and asked him whither he was bound in such fine trim. To dinner at Agathon, Socrates answered. I evaded him in his celebrations yesterday, fearing the crowd, but I agreed to be present today. Well, Socrates ends up inviting Aristodemus to join him, even though Aristodemus was not properly dressed for the dinner party. In fact, Apollodorus describes him as always barefoot, so very casual. But the two of them set off together. And then something curious happened. Apollodorus tells the story this way. Then Socrates, becoming absorbed in his own thoughts by the way, fell behind Aristodemus as they went, and when my friend began to wait for him, he bade him to go on ahead. All right, what's going on here? Well, let's look a little more. At the dinner party, one of the servants of the house reports this. Socrates had retreated into their neighbor's porch. There he was standing, and when bidden to come in, he refused. Now from here we're going to see a difference between Aristodemus' level of understanding and that of the host of the party, Agathon. How strange, said Agathon. You must go on bidding him, and by no means let him go. But this Aristodemus forbade. No, said he, let him alone. It is a habit he has. Occasionally he turns aside, anywhere at random, and there he stands. He will be here presently, I expect. So do not disturb him. Let him be. Well, next week when we look at Socrates' speech, we're going to see that Socrates talks about the experience of beauty itself. And he's going to describe it as something of a mystical experience. And so we can see this scene as a foreshadowing of that. I'm going to leave it for now, though, but I will have more to say about it next week. All right, so now we're at the dinner party and ready to see the conversation that unfolds. Remember, this is a dinner party for his friend Agathon, the writer of tragedies who just won a writing contest. The men at the party had all been celebrating, except for Socrates and Aristodemus. The other men had all been celebrating with Agathon the night before, and they drank a great deal. Many of them are hungover, and so they decide they're going to lay off the booze tonight. And then one of the men, Eriksen Marcus, has an idea, and he sets it up this way. And for this quote, just this one, I pulled from Thomas Taylor, just because sometimes when you take a quote out of context, it doesn't run smoothly. And so that was what happened with Walter Lamb's version of it. So this one is Thomas Taylor. No man should ever to this day have undertaken to give love his due praises, but that so great a God has been neglected to such a degree. Is it not astonishing? So they decide that each man in turn will give an impromptu speech to the god love. And now we're back to Walter Lamb. So if you on your part approve, Eriksen Marcus says, we might pass the time well enough in discourses. For my opinion is that we ought each of us to make a speech in turn, from left to right, praising love as beautifully as he can. And I've long suspected that this is what men talk about when there are no women in the room. Cars and action movies, that's all just a cover. All right, well, there are 5 speeches before Socrates's, and each one uses language that gives the impression that the speaker is saying something good and beautiful. But it's important to read those speeches more critically if you want to really see what Plato is doing here. You'll start to see that there are images of love, and these images are open to scrutiny. Now, I do see at the heart of this dialogue, or at least at this part of the dialogue, that there is a play of appearance versus reality. What we will see throughout all of Plato's teachings is that we're going to struggle to recollect wisdom until we see through what is false. Right? So last week we talked about the theory of recollection. Now we're seeing how to apply it. A common technique of Socrates, and one that Plato used as well in these dialogues, is to purge the interlocutor of his or her prejudices. Here's a quote from the Sophist. And this quote, as you can see, is from Francis Cornford. The purifier of the soul is conscious that his patient will receive no benefit from the application of knowledge until he is refuted, and from refutation learns modesty. He must be purged of his prejudices first, and made to think that he knows only what he knows, and no more. And so, talking about the purifier of the soul, last week we saw a little bit about the mystery traditions and the initiation ceremony. Before the initiation ceremony, there's some sort of purification. So the stages are purification and then initiation. And we're going to see that same pattern here in this dialogue. These first 5 speeches comprise the purification. Next week, we're going to see Socrates' speech, which is the initiation. And then it's followed by one final speech, which uses Socrates as the exemplar of someone who has actually done the work of moving from right opinion to knowledge. And so he is the example of the person who has manifested the virtues in the highest degree that is humanly possible. All right, I'm getting ahead of myself there. So today what we're doing is looking at the 5 speeches that comprise the purification. So we're going to start with speech number 1. And our speaker is Phaedras. Now Phaedras and Eriksen Marcus are actually good friends. And Eriksen Marcus, when he was talking about this idea of making speeches about love, he said he got the idea from a conversation he had with Phaedras. So it was actually Phaedras who had pointed out that love is a god who does not get his due. We're going to find that Phaedras romanticizes love as an ancient and venerable god. He says, thus love is by various authorities allowed to be of most venerable standing, and as most venerable, he is the cause of our highest blessings. Yet despite the lofty opening of his speech, he quickly turns his focus on physical relationships only. I, for my part, am at a loss to say what greater blessing a man can have in earliest youth than an honorable lover, or a lover than an honorable favorite. Now, when we get to Socrates' speech, we're going to see Plato's famous ladder of beautiful objects, and this all leads up to beauty itself. Physical attraction is just the bottom rung of the ladder. There are many other forms of love and beauty, but still it is one of the rungs. All right, so Phaedrus makes the claim that love has no parents. Now, I'm not going to say much about this except to point out that when we do get to Socrates' speech next week, he is going to include a myth about love's parents. And I'm going to talk about that next week. Right, Phaedrus goes on to make the case that love is a power, and it's a power that motivates us to act honestly and nobly. He says, what shall I call this power? The shame that we feel for shameful things, and ambition for what is noble, without which it is impossible for city or person to perform any high and noble deeds. So the way he's describing love is that it is a power that takes the forms of shame and ambition. So for Phaedrus, it seems that motivation does not come from some inner desire to know truth, but from the desire to appear noble and virtuous to his lover or his beloved. Now, for those of you who are familiar with Plato's presentation of the four virtues, I imagine that you recognize that this is a contradiction to temperance. And temperance is described as when the desires naturally fall in line with what is truly good, what is healthy for the soul. And by the way, for those of you who are new to the channel, there is a video on the four virtues. He goes on to say that the beloved is especially ashamed before his lovers when he is observed to be about some shameful business. All right, so we see here that he is not envisioning someone who is truly virtuous, even though he's using that language. He's talking about somebody who might be about some shameful business, and so someone who will only act virtuous if he's shamed into doing so. Phaedrus then goes on to suggest that love makes us brave, so that if we could somewise contrive to have a city or an army composed of lovers and their favorites, such men as these, when fighting side by side, one might almost consider able to make even a little band victorious over all the world. Well, when you think a little more about what he's saying here, he's implying that shame of looking cowardly is what makes us brave. Again, we've got another distortion of the virtues. This is not what courage truly is. Courage for Plato results from staying focused on what is truly good and right, and thus knowing what is and what is not to be feared. He ends his speech on a lofty note, as lofty as he had begun it. He says, so there is my description of love, that he is the most venerable and valuable of the gods, and that he has sovereign power to provide all virtue and happiness for men, whether alive or departed. So again, more of this beautiful flowery language. If you go carefully through his speech, though, you will find that this lofty claim of providing all virtue and happiness is not proven. Throughout the dialogue, there's really just rhetoric. Well, that brings us to speech number 2, Pausanias. Now, with this speech in particular, you've got to be careful. It's very easy to get swept up in the virtuous language. He talks of heavenly Aphrodite and the popular, or in some translations, earthly Aphrodite. And then he goes on to say that if the goddess were one, then love would be one. But since there are two of her, there must needs be two loves also. So he's going to talk of two loves, that love itself differs depending on which Aphrodite it honors. And so you can foresee that he's going to talk about virtue. Well, the love that belongs to earthly Aphrodite, or popular Aphrodite, he describes as random and vulgar. That love that belongs to the popular Aphrodite is in very truth popular and does his work at haphazard. This is the love we see in the meaner sort of men. But his focus in this speech is on the love that belongs to heavenly Aphrodite. He says the other love springs from the heavenly goddess. Even in the passion for boys, you may note the way of those who are under the single incitement of this love. They love boys only when they begin to acquire some mind, a growth associated with that of down on their chins. Well, if you read him quickly and you're not really taking it in, it sounds good because he's talking about desiring somebody with mind, that there's an intellectual side to love, that it's not just physical. But wait a minute, look more carefully. He's talking about boys who have down on their chins. Down is that very thin, colorless hair. Women have it on our faces, although we don't like to talk about it, and boys get it too. But before puberty, of course, once a boy hits puberty, he gets darker hair and either he grows a beard or he shaves. But before puberty, he also can have that thin, colorless hair. So Pausanias is talking about very young boys, maybe 10 years old or so. Now, it would take too long to go through the whole speech in detail. I could actually do a whole video just on this speech. Just from a artistic point of view, Plato did something really brilliant here, the way he is able to mold the wording and to give it an air of virtue when really what he's doing, what this man is saying, is really quite upsetting. I'm going to skip quite a bit, but I'm going to jump to his vision of the ideal love affair. And first, I'm going to read it straight through. It's a bit long. It is our settled tradition that when a man freely devotes his service to another in the belief that his friend will make him better in point of wisdom, it may be, or in any of the other parts of virtue, this willing bondage also is no part of baseness or flattery. Let us compare the two rules, one dealing with the passion for boys, and the other with the love of wisdom in all virtuous ways. By this we shall see if we are to conclude it a good thing that a favorite should gratify his lover. For when a lover and favorite come together, each guided by his own rule, on the one side of being justified in doing any service to the favorite who has obliged him, and on the other of being justified in showing any attention to the friend who makes him wise and good, the elder for his plenty contributing to the intellectual and all other excellence, the younger in his paucity acquiring education and all learned arts. Only then, at the meeting of these two principles in one place, only then and there and in no other case, can it befall that a favorite may honorably indulge his lover. Well, on the surface, it sounds like there's something about virtue here. You're talking about wisdom, you're talking about virtue, you're talking about intellectual and all other excellence. Let's go back, though. First of all, he's describing this relationship as willing bondage. That does not sound ideal, I think, to most of us. And then he says there are two rules. One dealing with the passion for boys. Well, which of them is going to have that passion, the young boy or the older man? Probably the older man. And the other rule is the love of wisdom in all virtuous ways. And then we see in the second half that they're each guided by their own rule, which means they're not both guided by both rules. The older man is guided by a passion for boys. The young boy is guided by a love of wisdom in all virtuous ways. Does that sound even? Does that sound virtuous on both sides? The young boy has to value wisdom in virtuous ways, but how about the older man? Nah, he doesn't have to value that. He just has to have a passion for boys. And that's what guides both of them. And as long as they both act on that rule, they both keep to their rule, then this is what he calls heavenly love. Now, if you follow the logic, then you'd say, well, at least the boy can choose if the man is wise or not. Because if the boy does not think that he's going to get wisdom in all virtuous ways from this older man, then it would not be heavenly love. That would make sense, but that's not what Pausanias says. He says, by the same token, when a youth gratifies a friend, supposing him to be a good man, and expecting to be made better as a result of his lover's affection. And then he finds he's deceived, since his friend proves to be vile and destitute of virtue. Even so, the deception is honorable. For this youth is also held to have discovered his nature, by showing that he would make anyone the object of his utmost ardor for the sake of virtuous improvement. And this, by contrast, is supremely honorable. Thus, by all means, it is right to bestow this favor for the sake of virtue. So virtue is determined solely by the boy's behavior, and the man can act any way he pleases. He can be as deceptive and dishonorable as he pleases. Now, by our modern standards, this is called grooming a boy, and this would land a man in jail. You may think that I'm being a little bit hard by judging Pausanias by these modern standards. I mean, maybe in ancient Greece they had a different age of consent, a different idea about this. I don't have time to go through the whole speech in detail. There's actually even more horrendous things that I skipped. But I will direct you to 183c, D, that area. Pausanias complains that fathers keep their young sons away from him. And so it's an indication that clearly this behavior was not accepted in Pausanias' day either. All right, well, he ends the speech by saying this. This is the love that belongs to the heavenly goddess, for this compels lover and beloved alike to feel a zealous concern for their own virtue. So again, if you read this quickly and you don't quite process what he's really saying, you could be left with the impression that he actually had said something good, because he uses all the right language. He talks about virtue, honor, love of wisdom, and so on. I think Plato must have had a lot of fun writing that one. All right, we're going to go on now to speech number 3. We have quite a bit to cover today. This is Eriksen Marcus. He's the one who had first recommended this idea of giving speeches to love. He is a doctor, and this is significant for his story because he's going to draw on his medical background to make the claim that what is dissimilar craves and loves dissimilar things. So in other words, opposites attract. He sets up love as some sort of harmony between opposites. He says the most contrary qualities are most hostile to each other. Cold and hot, bitter and sweet, dry and moist. And the rest of them. It was by knowing how to foster love and unanimity in these that our forefather Asclepius composed this science of ours. And Asclepius, I think most of you know, in Greek mythology is the founder of the medical art. All right, he goes on to talk about music as another example of opposites being brought together. Hence, in its turn, music is found to be a knowledge of love matters relating to harmony and rhythm. So he's talking here about harmony again as the blending of opposites attracting. Well, now the conventional view of temperance, that is not quite what Plato is talking about, is the moderation of pleasures. Eriksen Marcus uses this conventional view of temperance, and he holds this to be the role of love. He also accepted Pausanias' division of heavenly love and popular love, although he doesn't give any indication of accepting anything else in that speech. He says, well-ordered men, and the less regular, only so as to bring them to better order, should be indulged in this love. And this is the sort we should preserve. This is the noble, the heavenly love, sprung from the heavenly muse. But the popular love comes from the queen of various song, meaning, of course, popular Aphrodite. And in applying him, popular love, we must proceed with all caution, that no debauchery be implanted with the reaping of his pleasure. All right, so he also attached the common image of temperance to the role of diviners. He says, so further, all sacrifices and ceremonies controlled by divination, namely all means of communion between gods and men, are only concerned with either the preservation or the cure of love. For impiety is usually in each case the result of refusing to gratify the orderly love, or to honor and prefer him in all our affairs, and of yielding to the other. By the way, Socrates, too, in his speech that we're going to see next week, is going to talk about the role of diviners.
It's interesting to contrast these two views, so it's something to keep in mind. And so then I'm going to just wrap up there with Eriksen Marcus's speech. So we see that he's talking about opposites attracting, and he's talking about temperance as a moderation of pleasures. All right, well, now we're going to move on to speech number 4, and this is Aristophanes. Now, the historical Aristophanes was a writer of comedies. There's really nothing funny, though, about the story that he tells here. Now, of the 5 speeches that Plato rejects, this one is probably the most famous. It's also very much misunderstood. It's taken as a positive story that Plato embraced. In fact, I can think of many occasions when I told someone I'm interested in Plato, and their reply is that the only thing they know about Plato is that he had this idea that we're searching for our missing half. And oh, isn't that romantic? And everybody loves that story. Well, spoiler alert, Socrates is going to reject this idea very early in his own speech. I'm going to cover Socrates' speech next week, but I'm just going to pull out a few quotes from it. Actually, just one quote from it. He says, "Certainly there runs a story that all who go seeking their other half are in love, though by my account love is neither for half nor for whole, unless, of course, my dear sir, this happens to be something good. For men are prepared to have their own feet and hands cut off if they feel these belongings to be harmful." And then Socrates goes in a completely different direction. The idea of looking for our missing half just does not fly with him. And this refutation is underscored at the end of Socrates' speech when Apollodorus tells us that after Socrates had thus spoken, there was applause from all the company, except our current storyteller, Aristophanes, who was beginning to remark on the allusion which Socrates' speech had made to his own. So Aristophanes was not pleased with applauding. All right, so Socrates rejected this story of looking for our missing half. But why would he do that? Was he just not a romantic? Well, let's take a look at the story. According to Aristophanes, humans used to be double in size. The form of each person was round all over, with back and sides encompassing it every way. Each had 4 arms and legs to match these, and 2 faces perfectly alike on a cylindrical neck. And he goes on to describe the whole body this way, double of every body part. And these early humans were stronger than humans are now. Aristophanes says, "Now they were of surprising strength and vigor, and so lofty in their notions that they even conspired against the gods." And so the gods were bothered by this, and they debated what to do about these troublesome humans. And so you can see it starting to unfold as something of a Tower of Babel story. Well, Zeus came up with a plan. "I propose now to slice every one of them in 2, and so that while making them weaker, we shall find them more useful by reason of their multiplication." So it was an all-around win for the gods. They made humans weaker, and at the same time, the gods could now get twice as many sacrifices because there were now twice as many humans. However, it was not a happy situation for these newly formed humans. Now, when our first form had been cut in 2, each half in longing for its fellow would come to it again, and then would they fling their arms about each other and in mutual embraces yearn to be grafted together. Now, some find this image romantic, but what is this love really according to the story? So if you're following the story, this feeling that is called love is actually a pain, and it's a pain that results from a punishment that the gods inflicted on us because they saw us as sinful. Well, Aristophanes describes the feeling of finding one's missing half. "These are they who continue together throughout life, though they could not even say what they would have of one another." Right? So there's an ignorance that Aristophanes is attaching to love. Obviously, the soul of each is wishing for something else that it cannot express, only divining and darkly hinting what it wishes. So Aristophanes seems to be in a state of confusion about love himself, and his story is trying to romanticize this confusion. Instead, however, it comes across as a tragedy. Now, I suspect that one reason that this story has endured, despite ending up in Socrates' rejection pile, is because many people have the same confusion about love. The cause of it all is this, he ends his speech with, that our original form was as I have described, and we were entire, and the craving and pursuit of that entirety is called love. So he's envisioning humans as small and as incomplete. And many people do share this feeling. I see this as another reason why the story is as pervasive as it is. And it's also why Plato needed to include it among the purification speeches. So Aristophanes is presenting us as sinners, and love then is a pain that results from our punishment. And when you think about what the story really means, it's not such a romantic vision of love after all. All right, now we're going to wrap up with speech number 5. And this is Agathon, who is the one we're celebrating at this party. He begins by saying how he will organize his speech. He says, there is but one correct method of giving anyone any kind of praise, namely to make the words unfold the character of him and of the blessings brought by him who is to be our theme. Hence it is meet that we praise him first for what he is, and then for what he gives. Well, Socrates is later going to agree with this, and indeed the basic structure of dialectic we saw is to figure out what a thing is, and then how it functions. And that really is what Agathon says he's going to do. Well, in defining love, he says, so I say that while all gods are blissful, love is the most blissful, as being the most beautiful and the best. How most beautiful I will explain. First of all, Phaedras, he is the youngest of the gods. He singled out Phaedras here because Phaedras had called love the most ancient of the gods. So notice he describes love as most blissful, most beautiful, best, and youngest. He's going to add some other words too. Delicate and graceful. Notice that in all of these cases here, he is defining love by the object of love. He then goes on to talk about the goodness of this God, and he's going to sing the praises of love's virtue. And he's going to do this by going through all 4 of the virtues, starting with justice. Nor is there violence in his dealings, since love wins all men's willing service, and agreements on both sides willingly made are held to be just by our city's sovereign, the law. So there he's arguing that love is just. He also argues that love is temperate. We all agree that temperance is a control of pleasures and desires. We do not agree, but we'll put that aside. While no pleasure is stronger than love. If they are weaker, they must be under love's control, and he is their controller. So that love, by controlling pleasures and desires, must be eminently temperate. Well, I think by this time we can agree that being in control or controlling someone else is not what it means to be temperate, so it's a bit questionable there. He also makes a case that love is courageous. Observe how in valor not even the god of war withstands love. For we hear not of love caught by Ares, but of Ares caught by love, and namely the love of Aphrodite. The captor is stronger than the caught, and as he controls what is braver than any other, he must be bravest. Well, some questionable logic here, but there you have it. And then he goes on to wisdom. He says, the god is a composer so accomplished that he is a cause of composing in others. Everyone, you know, becomes a poet, though alien to the muse before, when love gets hold of him. Well, certainly many people do write poetry when they fall in love, and they do feel that inspiration. It's a bit questionable, though, to suggest that this inspiration is the same as wisdom. That's a hard one to defend. By the way, when we get to the dialogue Phaedrus, Socrates is going to talk about what he calls divine madness. And there he is going to talk about this kind of inspiration, and it is meaningful in its own right, but it is something different from wisdom. And so there you have the 5 speeches. And then your task, if you want to go through this purification, is to go back over them and to think about what are the images of love and what is incorrect about those images. Next week, we're going to get to Socrates' reaction of all these speeches. He has some harsh words for them. And then we're going to look at what he has to say about love. That is our initiation. I'm going to leave you with this quote of Socrates'. He said, when it's time for him to give his speech, he says, "Our arrangement, it seems, was that each should appear to eulogize love, not that he should make a real eulogy. And I am not to be called upon now as a eulogist in your sense, for such I cannot be. Nevertheless, I am ready, if you like, to speak the mere truth."
As always, if you have any questions or comments, please feel free to leave them below. Also, if you enjoyed what you saw, I would appreciate a thumbs up, and I hope that you'll think about subscribing if you haven't already. I do put out a new video each week. So next week I'm going to wrap up the symposium with a look at Socrates' speech, and also we're going to see what follows his speech. So I do hope you'll join me next week. Thank you.